The red light on the door reader blinked twice, then went dark, and Margaret Calloway stood very still in the fourth-floor hallway of the Ashbourne house, with her hand still resting against the brass plate that said 412, Magnolia Suite, waiting for the little mechanism to change its mind. It did not change its mind. She tried again, more slowly this time, the way she might coax a stubborn drawer, and the reader blinked red a second time and made a small electronic sound that seemed absurdly, almost apologetic. She was 89 years old. She had been married to Walter Kessler for 19 years, and she had just been locked out of her own bedroom. For a moment she simply stood there in the hallway, in her good gray coat, with her cane hooked over her forearm and her handbag heavy against her hip, and told herself there had been some mistake with the housekeeping schedule, or a fault in the electronic locks that the maintenance men were always tinkering with, because that was the kind of explanation a reasonable person reached for first. Margaret had spent a lifetime reaching for the reasonable explanation first. It was, she sometimes thought, both her best quality and the reason she was standing in a hotel corridor at 4:30 in the afternoon, unable to get into the room where her reading glasses, her medication, and her mother's wedding ring were sitting on the nightstand. She went downstairs. The lobby of the Ashbourne house smelled, as it always did at that hour, of coffee going cold in the urns by the fireplace and of the beeswax polish. The housekeeping staff worked into the mahogany rail every evening after the dinner crowd thinned. It was a smell Margaret had known since she was 6 years old, when her grandfather used to lift her onto the reception counter so she could watch him check guests in. And it did something to her now that it had done to her for 83 years. It made her feel, however briefly, that she knew exactly where she was in the world. She did not, at that moment, know exactly where she was in the world. Mrs. Calloway, the young woman behind the front desk, Priya, new since the spring, sweet-faced, 24, looked up and then, very quickly, looked back down at her computer screen. It was the kind of look people gave when they had been told something and did not want to be the one to explain it. "My key isn't working, dear," Margaret said. 412. I'll just check that for you. Priya's fingers moved over the keyboard with the particular carefulness of someone stalling. "It looks like there was a change made to the suite reservation this afternoon." A change. "I think you'd want to speak with Mr. Reyes about it. He's in the office." Or Priya glanced past Margaret's shoulder toward the elevator, and her face did something else. A small wince, and Margaret turned to see her husband crossing the lobby with the particular brisk, chin-forward walk he used when he had decided something and did not want to discuss it. Walter Kessler was 84, tall enough that he had never quite lost the habit of ducking slightly through doorways, though he had not needed to duck through this hotel's doorways in 12 years, and handsome in the specific, durable way of men who had been handsome all their lives and had never had to think about it. He was wearing the blue cashmere sweater she had given him for his 80th birthday, and he was not wearing his wedding ring. And Margaret noticed both of these things in the same half-second, the way you notice a picture is crooked before you've consciously registered why the wall looks wrong. Maggie. He said it the way he always said it. warm, a little too loud, performing ease for whoever might be listening. I was going to find you before you went up. Let's sit a moment. My key doesn't work, Walter. I know, yes, let's sit. He steered her, with a hand at her elbow that felt less like affection than like management, toward the two wing chairs by the unlit fireplace, the one she had sat in as a bride of 25 and as a widow of 41, and now, again, as whatever she was becoming this afternoon. She let herself be steered because her legs, after the walk from the pharmacy and the stairs she'd taken rather than wait for the elevator, had begun to ache in the deep way they did lately, and because some old, well-worn part of her still believed that if she simply waited long enough and stayed calm enough, whatever was wrong would turn out to be smaller than it looked. "I've been thinking," Walter said, once they were seated, once he had arranged his long legs and folded his hands in the particular judicious way he used when he wanted to look like a man, being reasonable, "that 412 has gotten to be more room than we need. All those stairs to the bath. That step down into the sitting area you're always catching your toe on. I don't catch my toe on it. You did in March. I did not catch my toe, Walter. I set my coffee down too close to the edge, and the point is," he said, with the mild, overriding patience of a man used to being allowed to finish his sentences, "I've arranged for you to move into 218. It's a lovely room, garden view, everything on one level. Daniel says it's one of the nicest rooms on that floor. 218. Margaret knew every room in the Ashbourne house, the way other women knew the furniture in their own front parlors, and 218 was a perfectly pleasant single room with a queen bed and a shower stall instead of a tub, the kind of room the hotel gave to a solo business traveler for 2 nights, not the kind of room a person kept her whole life in. "And you," she said, "where will you be staying, Walter?" "I'll keep 412, of course. It doesn't make sense to disrupt everything." He said this the way he might have said it doesn't make sense to switch banks, a piece of pure practical logic that a reasonable person would simply accept. "Denise has been having a difficult time since Robert died. You know that. And her lease is up at the end of the month. And it seemed kind, Maggie. It seemed like the kind thing to do to let her stay with us a while until she's back on her feet." Margaret sat very still. "With us," she repeated. "In the suite, temporarily." A small, quick shrug, the shrug of a man mentioning a scheduling detail. "She's bringing some things over this evening. I didn't want you walking in and being startled." She had, in fact, already walked in, or tried to. She thought of the 2 suitcases she had glimpsed by the service elevator on her way through the lobby 10 minutes earlier, dove gray with brass corners, suitcases she did not recognize, and she understood now with a small, sick drop in her stomach that she had walked past her own displacement without knowing what she was looking at. Walter. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her hands, folded in her lap, had begun very slightly to shake. "I am your wife. I know that, Maggie." He said it gently, the way you might correct a child who had misunderstood something obvious. "Nobody's talking about that changing. I just think, at our age, we have to be practical about what everyone needs. You need quiet and no stairs. I need—" He stopped, seemed to consider several endings to the sentence and settled on the smallest one. I need this to be simpler. Behind the front desk, Priya had found something urgent to do with the reservation printer. At the far end of the lobby, near the grand staircase, a bellman named Curtis stood with a luggage cart and did not look over, though Margaret could see in the careful blankness of his posture that he knew exactly what was happening and had been told, or had decided for himself, not to get involved. "You had my key deactivated," Margaret said, "before you told me any of this. I didn't want a scene in the hallway. There is a scene in the lobby instead. There doesn't have to be." He reached over and patted her hand, twice, the way you'd pat a nervous dog. "Nobody's putting you out on the street, Maggie. 218 is a perfectly nice room. Daniel's having your things moved over this afternoon." Something in her chest, some old familiar mechanism that had kept her upright through 40 years of a first marriage and 12 years of a second and 89 years of being underestimated by people who mistook her quiet for emptiness, told her very clearly, this is the moment, not the moment to make a scene. She had never in her life made a scene, and she was not going to start in the lobby of the hotel her grandfather had built with a fourth-grade education and a mortgage he'd been terrified of his whole life. But the moment to stop reaching for the reasonable explanation, because there wasn't one. There was only Walter patting her hand, mistaking 89 for finished. "I'd like to speak with Daniel," she said. "Alone, if you don't mind." Walter's face did something complicated. Irritation quickly folded away beneath the pleasant mask he wore for hotel lobbies. "Of course, I'll go check on Denise's things." He stood, straightened his sweater, and, at the very last, bent and kissed the top of her head, a gesture so exactly like every other time he had kissed the top of her head in 19 years of marriage that for one disorienting second she almost forgot what he had just done. Then he was walking away toward the elevator, toward the room with her mother's ring in it, and Margaret sat alone in the wing chair by the cold fireplace, with her hands folded and her heart going very fast and very quiet at the same time, the way it did when something enormous was arriving and had not yet fully landed. She reached into her handbag, out of a habit older than her marriage, older than her widowhood, older almost than memory, and closed her fingers around the small velvet pouch she had carried in one bag or another for 79 years. Inside it, worn smooth at the edges, was a brass key stamped with the letters W1. It did not open anything in this hotel anymore. The lock it had been cut for had been replaced in a 1994 renovation. The door behind which it used to turn moved, converted, absorbed into what was now the mezzanine business center. She kept it anyway. She had kept it through her father's death and her first husband's death and 100 renovations and 3 different management companies, because her grandfather had put it into her hand when she was 10 years old and said something she had never forgotten, and because some part of her had always understood, without being able to say exactly why, that the key was not really about the lock. She sat with it in her palm for a long moment. Then she rose, more slowly than she would have liked, using the arm of the chair the way her doctor had told her to, and her pride generally forbade, and walked toward the office behind the front desk, where Daniel Reyes had already, judging by the look on his face when he opened the door, been dreading this conversation for several hours. Daniel Reyes had been general manager of the Ashbourne House for 11 years and had worked there in one capacity or another for 22, and in all that time he had never once had to explain to Margaret Calloway who she was. That was, in fact, the single strangest and most important fact of his professional life, a fact he had carried carefully and privately since the week he'd been promoted from front office manager, and Foster Langley, the family's attorney, had taken him to lunch and told him, over crab cakes at a restaurant 2 blocks from the hotel, precisely who signed off on his salary. "Close the door, please," Margaret said, easing herself into the chair across from his desk. He closed it. "How bad is it?" she said. It was not really a question. Daniel exhaled slowly and sat down across from her, and for a moment he looked less like a general manager in a good suit, and more like the 26-year-old front desk clerk she remembered training on the old reservation software 15 years earlier, the one who used to ask her, half joking, whether she'd really grown up in the building because she knew where every pipe ran. "He came to me this morning," Daniel said, "told me he wanted the Magnolia Suite key reissued to a Mrs. Denise Ellery, and asked me to have your things moved to 218 by end of day. And you did it." I stalled as long as I could without it looking strange. I called Foster the second Mr. Kessler left my office. He rubbed a hand over his face. "Mrs. Calloway, I want to be very clear that I did not authorize that key reissue believing it would stand. I told the front desk to hold off on the actual card programming until I'd—" He stopped. "I should have called you myself the moment he asked. I'm sorry. I thought there might still be a version of this where it resolved itself before you had to walk into it." "There wasn't," she said, not unkindly. "There rarely is, with Walter, once he's decided something." She looked down at her hands, at the age spots, and the slight tremor she'd learned to work around, the way you learn to work around anything that has been part of you long enough. "He doesn't know, Daniel. I know he doesn't. I would like it to stay that way a little longer. Just a day. Maybe 2. She looked up. "I need to think, and I find I can't think clearly with him standing over me telling me what room I need." Daniel studied her for a moment, this small, silver-haired woman in her good gray coat, sitting very straight in the chair across from his desk, with her hands folded like a woman waiting for a job interview, rather than a woman who had, that afternoon, discovered her husband had moved another woman into her bedroom. And something in his chest, some mixture of anger on her behalf and pure professional loyalty, hardened into resolve. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "The Magnolia Suite key stays deactivated for Mrs. Ellery's card until I hear differently from you. I'll have housekeeping put you in the Camellia Suite on 6 for tonight. No charge, obviously, and no need to explain that to anyone." He paused. "Is there anything in 412 you need brought down? Anything at all?" Margaret thought of her mother's ring, of the framed photograph of her grandfather standing in front of the hotel's cornerstone in 1919, of the small cedar box where she kept 40 years of correspondence with people who mattered to her, most of them dead now, and of the brass key already safe in her handbag where it had been for the better part of a century. "My blue cardigan," she said, "and my reading glasses. Everything else can wait." She grew up, as it happened, on the 4th floor of that hotel, though not in Suite 412. In 1937, the year Margaret Whitmore was born, the 4th floor of the Ashbourne house held the family's private apartment, 4 connected rooms, behind an unmarked door, at the end of the hall, and it was there, and not in any hospital, that her grandmother Eliza had insisted the baby be delivered, because Eliza did not entirely trust Charleston doctors and did trust implicitly. The midwife, who had been coming to the hotel for 30 years to treat everyone from guests with sprained ankles to the laundress's children with fevers. Elias Whitmore had built the Ashbourne house in 1919 with a loan he was terrified of for the rest of his life, on a corner lot 2 blocks off the Battery that had, before that, held a burned-out livery stable. He had been a dry goods clerk with a 4th-grade education and an uncanny memory for names, and he had built, over 30 years, a modest, well-loved 60-room hotel that survived the Depression by turning half its rooms into long-term residences for schoolteachers and widows who could pay in installments, survived a hurricane in 1940 that took the entire East Wing roof, survived the lean years after the war when every serviceman's family wanted a motor court on the highway instead of a hotel downtown, and was, by the time Margaret was old enough to remember any of it, simply the center of the known universe. Her earliest memory, or what she believed was her earliest memory, though memory at 89 had a way of polishing itself smooth the way the mahogany rail was polished smooth, was of standing on a step stool behind the front desk, while her grandfather checked in a guest, a traveling salesman, she thought, though she couldn't have said what he sold, and watching her grandfather write the man's name in the register in his careful, looping hand, and then, without looking up, ask after the man's wife's hip, which had been troubling him on his visit 6 months before. "How did you know that?" she'd asked afterward. "About his wife's hip?" "I wrote it down," her grandfather said, and showed her the little index card file he kept beneath the counter, a card for every regular guest, notes in his own hand. "Daughter, married in June, prefers a room away from the elevator, allergic to feathers, wife's hip. A room is just 4 walls and a bed until somebody remembers something true about the person sleeping in it," he told her. "Then it's a place they'll come back to." She had not understood at 6 what he meant. She understood it better at 10, when he took her down to the mezzanine one afternoon, to what he called his office, a small room with a roll-top desk, a safe, and a single door that locked with a brass key he kept on his own ring, and let her sort receipts while he worked, and told her, apropos of nothing she could remember prompting, that a key was a piece of trust before it was a piece of metal, and that the day would come when he'd give her one of her own, and she'd know she'd earned it the day she stopped needing to be told what it meant. He gave her the key, the one stamped W1, cut for that same office door the year she turned 16, not as a gift exactly, more as a kind of appointment. By then, she was doing real work, reconciling the guest ledgers on Saturday afternoons, learning to read a balance sheet the way other girls her age were learning to read sheet music, sitting in on meetings with the hotel's accountant, where she was allowed, at first, only to listen, and then, gradually, to ask questions, and then, by 19, to have opinions that her father, Thomas Whitmore, who had taken over the hotel from Elias by then, occasionally, grudgingly, followed. She married Henry Calloway in 1962, an architect 9 years her senior, with a gentle laugh and a habit of sketching building facades on cocktail napkins. And she took his name the way everyone took their husband's name in 1962, without a second thought, and for 16 years she was Margaret Calloway, wife of an architect, mother of one son who died in infancy and whose small grave she still visited twice a year, keeper of the hotel's books on the side, because her father, aging, needed the help, and she was, by then, better at it than anyone else in the family. Henry died in 1978, a highway accident on the way back from a job site in Beaufort, and Margaret was 41 years old and a widow. And it was in the years after that, when her father's health began its long decline, that she stepped fully into the work she had been quietly training for her whole life, not as the public face of the Ashburn house, never that, she'd never wanted that, but as the person who understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what the hotel was and exactly what it owed the people who depended on it. It was her doing in 1979 that the family formalized what had until then been an informal understanding into the Whitmore Family Trust, with the hotel's operating entity, Ashbourne Hospitality Group, LLC, held beneath it. Professional management, brought in for the first time to run day-to-day operations, while the family retained ownership and a specific, carefully worded set of reserved powers. It was her father's doing, 2 years before his death in 1983, that an amendment was added to the trust documents, granting the senior surviving Whitmore descendant a title that would, in time, come to rest on Margaret alone, what the documents called Founder's Reserved Authority, sole discretion over the private residential floor, over the disposition of family archival materials, and over any matter the trustee determined touched the founding family's name or legacy. Her father had written it, he told her, because he had watched too many old hotels get sold out from under the families who loved them by relatives who didn't, and because he trusted his daughter's judgment more than he trusted anyone else's, including, eventually, his own. Margaret had used that authority, perhaps 4 times in 40 years. She was not a woman who reached for power the way some people reached for a coat on a cold day, first thing, out of habit. She had watched her father wield authority sparingly and well, and she had tried, in her own quieter way, to do the same, approving a beloved night manager's request to keep working past retirement age when the new management company wanted to modernize the staff, vetoing a 1990s renovation plan that would have torn out the original lobby staircase, quietly funding a housekeeper's daughter's tuition through a scholarship nobody but Daniel and the accountant knew traced back to her, stepping in exactly once in 2003 to stop a corporate buyout offer that would have turned the Ashbourne house into a chain property, with her grandfather's name sandblasted off the cornerstone. She had stopped using her maiden name professionally sometime in the 1970s, when it became simply easier, in 100 small daily transactions, to be Mrs. Calloway, rather than to explain the Whitmore connection to every new accountant and vendor, and later every new employee who had no reason to know the hotel's founding history beyond what was printed in the little laminated card in each guest room. And when she remarried in 2007, at 70 years old, to a charming, recently widowed insurance executive named Walter Kessler, whom she'd met at a Preservation Society gala, and who made her laugh for the first time in the 11 years since Henry's memory had stopped being an open wound and started being simply a part of her. She had not, in any of the easy early conversations two people have when they are falling in love late in life, sat him down and explained trust documents and reserved authority and the precise legal architecture of a hotel he assumed, reasonably enough, given everything she'd told him, had been sold by her family decades before. She had told him the truth as far as it went. She'd told him she grew up in a hotel her grandfather built, that her family had owned it once, that it meant a great deal to her, that they lived there now as a kind of family courtesy that had been arranged after her father's passing. All of that was true. What she had not told him, not out of deception, she would think later, turning the question over during the long sleepless nights that followed the afternoon in the lobby, but out of some deeper and harder-to-name instinct toward privacy, toward not wanting to be loved for the wrong reasons a second time in her life, was the precise shape of what she still held. She had believed in the early golden years of their marriage that it simply didn't matter, that Walter loved her and she loved him, and the specifics of an old family trust were paperwork, not love, and love was the thing that counted. She understood now, sitting in the Camellia Suite on the 6th floor with her blue cardigan across her knees and her reading glasses on the nightstand and her heart still going too fast, that she had made one significant misjudgment in that reasoning. She had assumed that if it ever did matter, if the day ever came when Walter needed to understand exactly who she was and exactly what authority she carried, he would ask. In 19 years of marriage, he never had. He had never once asked her a single question about the trust, about the ownership, about what family courtesy actually meant in a legal sense. He had simply accepted the comfortable version of the story that required nothing further of him, the way he accepted, without asking, that the coffee would be hot when he wanted it, and the car would start when he turned the key, and it was that incuriosity, more than any specific lie either of them had told, that Margaret found herself sitting with now, turning it over and over, like a stone worn smooth by water, feeling the particular ache of realizing that the person you had built a life with had never once been curious about the person you actually were. If you have someone in your own life, a grandmother, a mother, a neighbor down the street, an old coworker who's outlived most of the people who remember what she used to do all day, whose whole story you never quite got around to asking about, this next part is for you. Put her first name in the comments, or a single memory, even a small one. And if you find yourself moved by stories about people the world stopped bothering to really see, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more of these stories coming, and they deserve to be told all the way through. The escalation when Margaret looked back on it afterward, had not started with the suitcases by the service elevator. It had started, she came to understand, more than a year earlier, in ways so small she had talked herself out of naming them at the time. There had been the Tuesday afternoon phone calls. Walter began taking on the terrace instead of in the suite. Door closed, voice pitched low. There had been the new blazer, the haircut that took an extra 20 minutes at the barber, the cologne he hadn't worn in a decade suddenly reappearing on the dresser. There had been dinners he claimed were with old colleagues from the insurance firm, men whose names, when she'd asked after them, the way you ask after a husband's friends, he answered a beat too quickly, a beat too smoothly. She had noticed these things the way you notice weather changing, a pressure drop, a smell of rain, without yet believing a storm was actually coming. Then, 6 months ago, there had been the conversation in the dining room over the good china they used on Sundays, when Walter had set down his fork with a particular deliberateness and said, "I've been thinking, Maggie, that you might be happier somewhere with more support, somewhere with staff trained for, our stage of life." I have staff, Walter. I've had staff my whole life, one way or another. I mean medical staff, on site. I'm not ill. You forgot your doctor's appointment last month. I forgot the date, not the appointment. I called and rescheduled it myself, which is more than I can say for you and your dental cleanings. She'd meant it lightly, the old teasing rhythm of their marriage, but Walter hadn't laughed, and something in his face, a kind of clinical appraisal, as though he were assessing a used car rather than looking at his wife, had stayed with her long after the meal ended. After that, the small violations had come more quickly. He began speaking for her at the front desk, answering questions the staff addressed to her as though she weren't standing right there. He asked Daniel once whether someone could start bringing paperwork to him directly rather than to Margaret, just to simplify things, a request Daniel had quietly declined without ever mentioning it to her at all, though she'd later find out about it from Foster Langley. He mentioned, twice, at dinner parties, in the particular jocular tone men used when they wanted to say something cruel and have it received as charming, that Maggie was getting a little forgetful these days, and both times she had smiled and said nothing, and felt something in her chest fold a little further in on itself. Because the alternative, correcting him publicly, defending herself in front of guests, felt to her indistinguishable from making a scene, and Margaret Calloway did not make scenes. She had learned that lesson so early and so thoroughly, watching her grandmother smooth over 100 small embarrassments in the hotel lobby with nothing but a lowered voice and a change of subject, that it had become less a rule she followed than a fact about who she was. It was, she understood now, both her deepest strength and her most costly flaw. It had made her, for 80 years, a woman other people trusted instinctively, because she never used what she knew as a weapon, and never postured with what she had. And it had also made her, for the last several years of her marriage, a woman who absorbed a slow, steady accumulation of small cruelties without ever once saying out loud, in a voice loud enough to be believed, that they were cruelties. She had told herself each time that dignity meant not making a fuss. She was beginning to understand, sitting alone in the camellia suite with a stranger's suitcases somewhere below her, in the room that had been her bedroom that morning, that she had confused dignity with silence, and that they were not, in fact, the same thing at all. Denise Ellery moved into the Magnolia Suite that evening. Margaret knew this because Ruth Alcott, 81 years old, retired from housekeeping 11 years earlier, still living 2 blocks from the hotel, and still, by long habit, dropping by the staff break room most afternoons for coffee, with women half her age who'd known her when she trained them, called Margaret's cell phone at 7 that evening, her voice tight with an old employee's outrage. "I heard what he did," Ruth said, without preamble. "I want you to know I heard, and I want you to know I am not going to pretend I didn't. Ruth, he had Consuela move your things out of that closet like you'd died, Margaret. My niece works the evening shift. She called me crying about it. That woman's dresses are hanging where your things were not 3 hours after you left the room." A pause, and then, more quietly, "Your father would have had him thrown out on the sidewalk." "My father," Margaret said, "would have wanted me to think first." "You've been thinking for 60 years. When do you get to stop thinking and start doing something?" It was a fair question, and Margaret did not have a ready answer for it. Not that night. What she had instead, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed of the camellia suite with the brass key in its velvet pouch on the nightstand beside her reading glasses, was a growing, quiet, unhurried clarity. Not the hot clarity of anger, though there was anger in it too, but the older, colder clarity of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading balance sheets and knew with total certainty exactly what resources she had and exactly how they could be used. In the morning, she asked Daniel to have Foster Langley meet her for lunch. Foster Langley had been the Whitmore family's attorney for 31 years, had drafted the 1994 restatement of the trust, had sat across the table from Margaret's father in 1981 when the Founders' Reserved Authority Clause was added, and had, in all that time, developed a professional fondness for Margaret that went beyond the ordinary courtesy of a long-time client relationship. He was 73 now, silver-templed, precise in his speech in the way of a man who had spent his career choosing words that would hold up in court. And when Margaret told him over she crab soup at the small restaurant 2 blocks from the hotel where they always met, exactly what had happened in the lobby the day before, he set down his spoon and did not pick it back up for some time. "He has no idea," Foster said finally. "None. 19 years. He knows I grew up here. He knows my family owned it once. In some vague historical sense, he's never asked me to clarify. He believes it was sold in the 80s, the way most old family hotels get sold, and that we live here now because of goodwill toward a woman whose grandfather built the place. She stirred her soup without eating it." I let him believe that, Foster. I want to be honest about that part. I never lied to him, not exactly. But I let the comfortable version stand because the truth felt like something I didn't need to hand him, and because I suppose some part of me was afraid of what it would mean if he loved the truth more than he loved me. And now I'd like to know precisely what I can do. Foster was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass a slow quarter turn on the tablecloth. the old habit of a man organizing his thoughts before he committed to them out loud. Under the trust as restated in 1994, and per your father's amendment, he said, you hold sole discretion over the private residential floor. That includes the Magnolia Suite specifically. Margaret, it's named in the schedule of reserved units. And sole discretion over who may reside there and under what terms. Mr. Kessler's residency in that suite has never been in his own name. It's always been under yours, as an accommodation extended to a spouse of the trustee. Legally, he has no independent claim to that room at all. None. You could have the locks changed this afternoon, and he would have no standing to contest it. And Denise Ellery has considerably less standing than that. She's not party to anything. She's a guest in a room she has no right to occupy, moved in by a man who has no right to grant that occupancy. Margaret was quiet, watching a waiter cross the far side of the room with a tray of oysters, thinking not in that moment about Denise Ellery's rights, but about Denise Ellery herself, a woman Margaret had met exactly twice, both times briefly, both times at charity functions, where Walter had introduced her as a dear friend of ours from the bridge club, and who had, on both occasions, struck Margaret as tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. A recent widow, Margaret understood, a woman who had lost a husband of 40 years to cancer 18 months earlier, and who had, by every account Margaret had gathered since, been telling her own friends a story about Walter that did not match the story Margaret was living inside. A story, apparently, in which Walter's marriage had essentially ended years ago, in which his wife's health was declining rapidly, in which he had been, in Denise's understanding, little more than a devoted caretaker for a woman who could no longer really be his wife in any meaningful sense. I don't want this to be simple, Margaret said finally. I know the law makes it simple. I don't want it to be simple. It rarely is with you, Foster said, not unkindly. What do you want it to be? True, Margaret said. I want it to be true all the way down before anyone acts on it. I want Walter to understand exactly what he did and exactly who he did it to, not because I want to punish him with the knowing, but because I refuse to let him spend the rest of his life believing he got away with something small when what he did was not small at all. She looked up. And I want Denise Ellery to understand what she was told and by whom before anyone asks her to be the villain in this. I don't think she is one. I think she may simply be another woman Walter found it convenient to lie to. Foster studied her for a long moment, the same look he'd given her 30 years earlier across her father's desk, watching a young widow ask harder questions about a balance sheet than most men in the room. Your father used to say, he said, that you had better judgment about people than anyone he'd ever met, and worse judgment about when to use it on your own behalf. My father, Margaret said, with the faintest ghost of a smile, was not entirely wrong. The brass key had not opened a working lock since 1994, but it opened, still, the door to the small archival room on the mezzanine level where the hotel's oldest records were kept. Not because the key itself fit that door, but because it was, quite simply, the thing Margaret always carried in her handbag, and because on the afternoon she asked Daniel to walk her up there, She found herself taking it out of its pouch and holding it in her palm the entire time, the way you might hold a rosary, not for what it unlocked, but for what it remembered. The archival room held, among boxes of old menus and photographs, and a leather-bound guest register from 1921 with her grandfather's handwriting still legible on the first page, the original bound minutes of the Whitmore Family Trust, going back to 1958, and the 1981 amendment establishing the founder's reserved authority, her father's signature at the bottom in the same careful hand he'd used to teach her long division. Margaret sat with these documents for the better part of an afternoon, Daniel bringing her coffee twice, and the second time, sitting with her a while without saying anything at all, simply keeping her company the way he sensed she needed. "There's a photograph in here somewhere," she said eventually, "of my grandfather standing at the front desk with a guest whose name I can't remember, from sometime around 1935. I used to know exactly which box it was in. I'm finding I don't anymore, and it's making me feel very old." "You are very old," Daniel said, gently enough that it made her laugh. A real laugh, the first one in 2 days. "I am," she agreed. "I am very old, and I built almost nothing in my life that I can point to the way my grandfather could point to this building. And I have spent the last 2 days discovering that the thing I did build, a marriage, a home, a life with a man I genuinely believed loved the whole of me, turned out to be built on ground I never bothered to test." She set the trust document down carefully, the way you'd set down something breakable. "I keep thinking about what my grandfather told me the day he gave me this key. He said a key means responsibility before it means ownership. I understood that to be about the hotel. I'm only now understanding it might have been about everything." "What do you mean?" "I mean I have spent my whole life being responsible for this place, and being careful with what I knew, and being quiet about what I had. And I told myself that was humility, and maybe some of it was. But some of it, I think, was fear. Fear that if people really understood what I carried, they'd love the carrying and not the woman doing it." She looked up at him. "I don't think Walter ever once wondered what was underneath the version of me he found convenient. And I let him not wonder for 19 years because it was easier than finding out I was right to be afraid." Daniel didn't have an answer for that, and to his credit, he didn't try to invent one. He simply sat with her a while longer in the small room full of the hotel's whole history, while outside the single high window, the late afternoon light moved slowly across Meeting Street, and eventually Margaret gathered the documents she needed, put the brass key back in its pouch, and asked him to call Foster Langley and arrange a meeting for Friday morning. Denise Ellery had been married to Robert Ellery for 41 years, had raised 2 children with him in a house on James Island, and had believed, until the week he died, that she understood the shape of her own life reasonably well. 18 months of widowhood had taught her that she understood it considerably less well than she'd thought. And Walter Kessler, when he began appearing at her bridge club with his easy laugh and his attentive questions, and his particular gift for making a woman feel, after decades of being unremarkable to her own husband, suddenly and completely seen, had felt, for a while, like proof that some part of her life might still be salvageable. He had told her things, over the months that followed, that she had believed because she had no reason not to. That his marriage had been, for years, more a caretaking arrangement than a partnership. That his wife's memory had begun to fail badly, that she often didn't recognize him some mornings, that they'd agreed, quietly, some time ago, that he'd continue to look after her, but that the marriage in any real sense had ended. He'd told her his wife came from an old local family, some historical connection to the hotel they lived in, though he understood the property itself had been sold off decades ago, and they simply lived there now as a courtesy from the current owners out of respect for her family name. Denise had not asked many follow-up questions. She understood now, standing in the middle of the Magnolia Suite 2 days after moving her things in, surrounded by unfamiliar furniture and a view of the harbor she hadn't earned, and a closet where another woman's blue cardigan had, until 2 days ago, apparently hung, that she probably should have. There had been small things that snagged in retrospect. The deference the hotel staff showed toward Mrs. Calloway that seemed disproportionate to a woman with declining memory and no real standing in the building. The way the general manager's face had tightened, almost imperceptibly, when Walter introduced her as staying temporarily in the suite. The fact that in 2 days she had not once glimpsed the woman Walter described as barely lucid, but had instead heard, through the wall separating the suite from the hallway, a phone conversation in a voice that was clear, precise, and entirely undiminished, discussing what sounded very much like a legal appointment. She was still turning these small snags over in her mind on Friday morning, sitting at the small writing desk by the window with a cup of coffee going cold, when there was a knock at the door, and Daniel Reyes stood in the hallway with an expression she couldn't quite read, and told her that Mrs. Calloway would like to speak with her if she was willing, downstairs in the small private dining room off the lobby in 20 minutes. Walter arrived at the meeting, believing he was there to sign paperwork. Foster Langley had called him the evening before and told him only that there were some administrative matters concerning the residential arrangements that needed to be finalized. And would he come down to the small conference room adjoining the manager's office at 10 o'clock Friday morning? Walter, who had spent 30 years in the insurance business, signing far more consequential documents than he imagined this to be, had agreed without much thought, had even felt, walking down that morning in his good navy blazer, a small private satisfaction. This was, he assumed, simply the last administrative step in formalizing his wife's move to 218, tidy and unremarkable, the kind of thing that happened when people got older and their living arrangements needed adjusting. He opened the door to find the room considerably fuller than he expected. Margaret sat at the head of the small conference table, in the same gray coat she'd worn 2 days earlier, her hands folded in front of her, entirely composed. Foster Langley sat to her right, a folder of documents squared neatly in front of him. Daniel Reyes stood near the window, rather than sitting, the posture of a man present in a professional capacity rather than a personal one. And beside Foster, looking as though she had been given very little warning and had spent the intervening time absorbing something she was still working to fully understand, sat Denise Ellery. Maggie. Walter's easy public voice faltered slightly. I wasn't expecting. What's this about? Sit down, Walter, Margaret said, not unkindly, simply the way you'd say it to anyone. He sat. I want to start, Foster said, opening the folder in front of him, by establishing something for the record. Though this isn't a legal proceeding, and nothing said here today needs to leave this room, unless the people in it choose to share it. Mr. Kessler, are you aware of the ownership structure of this hotel? It was sold years ago, Walter said, with the faint impatience of a man being asked to restate something obvious. Margaret's family owned it generations back. I understood the property changed hands sometime in the 80s. It did not, Foster said. The Ashbourne house has been continuously owned since 1958 by the Whitmore Family Trust. The operating company beneath it, Ashbourne Hospitality Group, is a wholly owned subsidiary of that trust. Professional management runs day-to-day operations, which is why you've never had occasion to think much about who actually holds title to the building you've lived in for the last 12 years. He paused, letting that land, and then continued evenly, without theatrics. Margaret Whitmore Calloway is the senior surviving descendant of the Trust's founder, and under a 1981 amendment, holds what the Trust documents term Founders' Reserved Authority, sole discretion over the private residential floor of this hotel, including the Magnolia Suite, which has never, at any point in the last 12 years, been held in your name, Mr. Kessler. It has been held exclusively in hers, extended to you as her spouse. The room was very quiet. Walter's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. The first, disbelief, genuine and total, the look of a man who had built an entire mental architecture around a fact that had just been demonstrated to be false. The second, a flicker of something that looked almost like calculation, as though some part of him were already trying to work out how this new information might be managed rather than felt. And the third, arriving last and staying longest, something that finally looked like fear. That's not... He stopped, started again. You told me it was sold. I never told you that, Margaret said quietly. I told you my family owned it once. I let you believe the rest because you never asked me to clarify it, and because for a very long time it did not occur to me that you needed to know precisely what I held in order to love the woman holding it. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. I have thought a great deal these last 2 days about why I let that stand for 19 years, Walter. And I've come to understand it wasn't really about protecting the hotel. It was about protecting myself. I wanted very badly to be loved for exactly who I was, and not for what I owned. And so I made it easy for you to love a version of me that required nothing further from you. I understand now. That was a mistake. Not because you didn't deserve to know. You'll have to judge for yourself whether you earned that. But because it meant I spent 19 years married to a man who never once thought to ask a single serious question about the person he'd married. You knew how I took my coffee. You never once asked what I did before you met me, or why the staff here treat me the way they do, or what my grandfather's name meant in this city before you knew mine. She let that settle. That is the thing I find hardest to forgive, Walter. Not the room, the not asking. Walter's jaw worked. I love you, Maggie. This doesn't change that. I believe you loved a great deal about me, Margaret said. I no longer believe you loved all of me, because you never troubled yourself to find out what all of me was. And 2 days ago, when you believed I was simply an old woman whose usefulness had run its course, you moved another woman into my bedroom and had the locks changed before you told me, which is not the behavior of a man who loves the whole of anyone. It's the behavior of a man managing a liability. Beside Foster, Denise Ellery had gone very pale. He told me, she said quietly, to no one in particular, and then, gathering herself more directly to Margaret, he told me your marriage had ended in every real sense years ago, that you didn't recognize him some mornings, that you'd both agreed quietly that he'd care for you and move on with his own life. Her hands, folded on the table, had begun to tremble slightly. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I want you to know. I didn't know. I believe you, Margaret said, and something in her voice, turned toward Denise, was gentler than it had been toward Walter, because she meant entirely what she'd told Foster 2 days earlier. This woman was not the villain of the story, only another person Walter had found it convenient to deceive. You lost a husband 18 months ago, and a man told you a story that let you believe you were helping someone rather than harming them. That is not the same thing as what he did to me, and I won't pretend it is, but I don't hold it against you. Walter, watching this exchange, seemed to understand for the first time that the room was not merely reorganizing around a fact he hadn't known. It was reorganizing around a version of his wife he had never once bothered to see. A woman who had, apparently, been quietly and consistently more capable, more connected, more consequential than he had allowed himself to imagine in 19 years of marriage, because it had simply never occurred to him that there might be more to ask about. So, what happens now? He said finally, and his voice, for the first time since Margaret had known him, had lost its easy-performing warmth entirely. What happens now, Margaret said, is that Mrs. Ellery is welcome to remain a guest of this hotel at the standard rate for as long as she needs to arrange other accommodations. And I hope, Denise, you'll let Daniel help you with that rather than rushing, because none of this is your fault, and you deserve time to think clearly. She turned back to Walter, and you will be moved today into a standard room on a lower floor at the standard guest rate for a period of 30 days, which is considerably more grace than you extended me 2 days ago. During that time, I expect you'll want to arrange permanent accommodations elsewhere, because the Magnolia Suite will not be available to you again, and neither, I think, will I. You're divorcing me. I am, Margaret said, and there was no triumph in it, only a great and settled weariness, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent a lifetime avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, and had discovered at 89 that avoiding it had cost her more than having it ever could. I loved you, Walter. I want you to know that was real, whatever else was not. But I find I am not willing to spend whatever years remain to me being managed by a man who mistook my quiet for my whole self. He tried, in the days that followed, several different versions of contrition, none of which Margaret found herself able to fully believe. First, he blamed Denise, told Foster's office that he'd been manipulated by a grieving widow looking for financial security, a claim so transparently self-serving and so plainly contradicted by everything Denise herself had said in that room that even Walter seemed to abandon it within a day. Then he tried minimizing. It wasn't really an affair, he insisted to Margaret, over a stilted phone call, just companionship, just an old man afraid of being alone. Surely she could understand that. Then, finally, cornered by the plain facts of what he'd actually done, the deactivated key, the suitcases, the room reassignment arranged before she was told, he arrived one afternoon at the standard room on the second floor where he was staying out his 30 days and simply wept and told her he didn't know how he'd let it get that far, and asked one more time whether there was any way back. Margaret sat with him a while that afternoon, not because she believed reconciliation was coming, but because she found, to her own surprise, that she still cared enough about the man she had loved for 19 years to want to see him through his reckoning with some measure of grace, the grace he had not extended her. "I don't think you're a monster, Walter," she told him. "I think you got frightened of getting old and dying, the way a great many people get frightened of it, and you found it easier to imagine yourself young and wanted again with a woman who didn't yet know your habits than to sit with a wife who did. I understand the fear. I don't excuse what you did with it." She folded her hands. "I'm not going to take you back. But I'm also not going to pretend the last 19 years didn't happen, or that some of them weren't good. You'll leave with your dignity, because I intend to keep mine. And that means not stripping you of yours out of spite. But you will leave." He left at the end of the 30 days for a rented condominium on Folly Beach that his daughter from his first marriage helped him find. Denise Ellery, for her part, moved out of the hotel within a week, declined Walter's several attempts to see her again, and sent Margaret, some 2 months later, a short handwritten note that said only, "I am sorry for my part in your pain, and grateful you never made me carry more of it than was mine to carry." Margaret kept the note in the cedar box with her old correspondence, not because it resolved anything, but because it seemed to her like the kind of honest small gesture that deserved to be kept. The divorce was finalized the following spring, quiet, uncontested, handled almost entirely by Foster Langley's office, with a gentleness that spared Margaret nearly every indignity the process might otherwise have held. She moved back into the Magnolia Suite in October, 3 weeks after Walter left. Daniel had kept it empty and unoccupied the entire 30 days, not simply as a courtesy, but, he told her later, because it hadn't felt right giving it to anyone else while she decided what she wanted. And on her first evening back, she stood a long while at the window, overlooking the harbor, in the room with her mother's ring, back on the dresser, and her grandfather's photograph rehung on the wall, and let herself, for the first time in weeks, simply grieve. Not the marriage exactly, or not only the marriage. She grieved the version of the story she had believed she was living inside, a story about a woman who had found, late in life, an easy and uncomplicated second love, and made room, slowly, for the truer, harder, more interesting story she'd actually lived, which was about a woman who had spent her whole life being quietly, thoroughly herself, whether or not the people around her bothered to notice. She did not, in the months that followed, become a different woman. She still needed both hands on the rail, going down the grand staircase. She still forgot words, sometimes, mid-sentence, and had to wait, patiently, for them to come back to her, the way you wait for a slow elevator. She still, some mornings, woke with an ache that had nothing to do with her joints, a plain grief for the marriage she had believed she had. Her victory, such as it was, did not restore anything she had lost. It simply returned to her the plain, ordinary right to decide for herself what the remaining years of her life would be for. She used part of that right the following spring to do something she had been turning over since the week of the divorce. She met with Foster and Daniel and asked them to help her set aside 4 rooms on the 3rd floor, never advertised, never listed among the hotel's standard inventory as short-term transitional housing for women, generally older, who found themselves suddenly and unfairly displaced. Widows whose in-laws had moved to claim a family home, women leaving late-life marriages that had turned unsafe or unkind, anyone who arrived, as Margaret had very nearly arrived, at the discovery that the room they'd believed was theirs no longer was. Ruth Alcott, delighted to be asked, came out of retirement 2 days a week to help run it. Margaret named it, after some thought, Eliza's Rest, for her grandmother, the woman who had insisted on delivering her own granddaughter inside these walls, rather than trust the hospital, because it seemed to Margaret, turning the choice over, that the name should belong to someone who had made a home out of this building before her, rather than to herself. She still carries the brass key. It sits now, most days, in a small glass case near the concierge desk, beside a photograph of Elias Whitmore, standing at the front counter in 1935. She found the photograph, eventually, in the archival room, in a box, exactly where she should have remembered it was all along, with a small brass plate beneath the case that reads simply W1, Ashbourne House, 1919. Visitors ask about it sometimes, and the staff, trained now by Daniel, tell an abbreviated version of the story, an old key from before electronic locks, belonging to the family that built the place. Margaret, when she happens to be nearby, and someone asks her directly, tells them a little more. She tells them her grandfather gave it to her when she was 16 and told her that a key means responsibility before it means ownership, and that she had spent most of her life understanding that sentence to be about a building. She tells them, if they seem like the kind of person who wants the fuller answer, that she has come to understand it was never really about the building at all. It was about deciding over and over, for as long as you're given, who gets to say what a room or a marriage or a life actually means, and about learning, late, that the decision was always hers to make. Some people wonder how much they've truly understood the people closest to them. A spouse, a parent, a grandmother who never quite got around to telling the whole story. If Walter had asked one real question in 19 years, would any of this have happened at all? We'd love to hear what you think in the comments, And if stories about people who are more than the world bothers to see matter to you, stay close. There are more of these on the way. The elevator in the Ashbourne House lobby still gives its old two-note chime when it reaches the ground floor, a sound the hotel kept through every renovation because enough guests over enough decades told the family it felt like coming home. Margaret hears it most mornings now, crossing the lobby for her coffee, and it no longer sounds, to her, like the sound of a life interrupted. It sounds simply like a door opening onto a room she was always, quietly, entitled to keep.